Militant empathy. Hey, it's me, your gal, Militant Empathy. If you're new here, firstly, welcome to the show. Welcome to my little deranged corner of the internet. I hope that you will like it here. This is a podcast where I like to take a bit of a deep dive into a range of different social and political topics. And in every episode, I'll unpick the subject of the day from a variety of different angles, often philosophy or history-based. So the idea is that we all get to marinate our little brain stews for an hour or so and hopefully have a nice time doing it. Now this episode, I'm going to take you on a little journey through the world of justice, quite broadly defined. So we're going to be talking about the legal system, but we're also going to be talking about ethical questions and what is justice? A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This show, we're going to touch on physical and mental abuse, assault, HIV and AIDS, and the carceral system as a whole. So I'll try and flag these as they come up so you can tune out as and when. But with that in mind, if these things are something you'd rather not focus on today, feel free to give this episode a miss. Maybe listen back to one of the earlier episodes of the show, which are all available on all major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. Yay! Right, now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I want to start us on our little journey through the world of justice. Now, when I started researching the show and reading around themes of justice, a lot of the usual things came up, like the criminal justice system, prison abolitionism, police brutality, state oppression, etc. And I do want to talk about that, and we will get to that later on. But I was surprised to find that most of what I was reading was not about the judiciary system, even though they were texts about the judiciary system. Rather, they were much more concerned with questions of ethics, power, and performance. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So if you're expecting an hour on this is why prisons are bad, I'm sad to say that this episode will be a disappointment. Instead, what I'm hoping to arrive at by the end of the show is a more overarching consideration about, what is fair and why, and what is a just outcome, and where do the biggest injustices in our society lie. Now, to begin our slightly rambling journey today, I'd like you, dear listener, to cast your mind back, if you will, to a fateful Friday night in early July 2023. Now, I know that the ever-pervasive hold of social media over our tiny monkey brains has fried our attention spans to about 0.3 seconds, so I might as well be asking you to think about the prehistoric era. But just bear with me for a moment and cast your mind back specifically to July the 7th. So this was the day that we all collectively realized that, contrary to the lasting impression left by pretty much every role he has ever played, Jonah Hill does in fact fuck. Because professional surfer and model Sarah Brady, a self-admitted ex-girlfriend of Hill, began posting screenshots of conversations that occurred between the two of them during their ultimately ill-fated relationship. The text messages show Hill communicating a series of his quote-unquote boundaries to Brady as conditions for continuing their relationship. These boundaries were apparently exclusively limited to things that Brady was no longer supposed to do, which included surfing with men, boundaryless, inappropriate friendships with men. Neither what constituted boundaryless or inappropriate was defined, by the way, which is handy. Also modeling, posting pictures of yourself in a bathing suit. And this is my personal favorite. Friendships with women in unstable places from your wild and recent past beyond getting a lunch or coffee or something respectful. Needless to say, the screenshots went instantly uber viral, and a slew of internet discourse ensued. Predictably, a lot of commentators who were often, but by no means exclusively, of the male persuasion saw absolutely nothing wrong with Jonah's increasingly unhinged litany of boundaries. For example, a prominent Twitch streamer, XQC, who is incidentally currently at the time of writing in August 2023, on the receiving end of his own accusations of abuse from current and former girlfriends, saw absolutely nothing wrong with Jonah's boundaries and had this to say on one of his streams back in July. I think it's appropriate if you meet somebody to say something as unhinged as, if you're not willing to wear a hat all the time and have spaghetti in your pockets, we can't be together. It's all about finding something that's a fit for you. If you only date somebody that wears a hat, if it's very important for them to wear a hat and they have spaghetti in their pockets, right? I think that's a request that is important to you. If they don't want to abide by that because that's not who they are, then they can walk away. Then they can not date, right? XQC's response was pretty much the boilerplate for takes from the right/center right of the political spectrum. They argued we, as human beings, are allowed to make any request we like of other human beings, and they have an equal and parallel freedom to either accept or reject that request. No attention needs to be given to the actual contents of the request or the conditions surrounding it. Again, predictably, a lot of commentators on the left of the socio-political spectrum fundamentally disagreed with this take, most pointing out that this seemingly endless list of demands actually didn't constitute legitimate boundaries. For example, podcaster and internet commentator Matt Bernstein, who goes by the handle MattXIV on Insta, had this to say. Boundaries are guidelines we create within relationships to make sure we feel safe and respected. They outline the expectations our friends and partners can have for us within those relationships. Boundaries are not demands, nor are they attempts to strip someone of their personal or professional autonomy. He went on to give some examples of legitimate boundaries like, I need some time alone every day, and alcohol makes me anxious, so I'm not going to come with you tonight. And then some illegitimate boundaries like, you cannot speak to other men at work, and you cannot wear bikinis. So essentially, where XQC argues that consenting adults can kind of ask anything of each other and that's sort of fair game, so long as the other person is free to walk away, Bernstein is saying, no. Actually, we need to have some consideration not only to how we ask things of our partners, but what it is that we are asking them. Now, right about now, you might be asking yourself, why are we starting an hour-long deep dive into the subject of justice by rehashing the extremely online takes of random internet commentators on the breakdown of a celebrity relationship? And do you know what? That would be an extremely fair question, to which I would answer, firstly, I simply will not allow the phrase friendships with unstable women from your wild and recent past to die. It is too good, and we cannot be allowed to forget it. Secondly, I do think that we can gain some insights from this little nugget of pop culture on the question of ethics. Fundamentally, what leads Bernstein and XQC to such wildly different takes, then, is their contrasting understanding of ethics, specifically a branch of ethics called normative ethics. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in this because we have a whole lot of particularly spicy takes to cover in this show. But essentially, just to give a little whistle-stop tour of ethics, there are three main branches of the study of ethics within philosophy. There is what we might call descriptive ethics, which is basically just describing the world as it is, but not really saying anything about how things ought to be. So, for example, saying something like late-stage capitalist societies have tended towards the growth of the billionaire class, but not really passing any judgment on whether or not that is a good or a bad thing, would be an example of descriptive ethics. I don't really understand the use of descriptive ethics, but hey, it's something that exists. Now I've told you it exists, so okay, we've covered that. Then there is what we might call meta-ethics, which is a particularly insufferable branch of ethics that deals with definitions. So not so much identifying things that we should do because it's good, but asking infuriating questions like, what is good? Suffice to say, discussions of meta-ethics can only be had by law by people wearing black turtlenecks and simultaneously inhaling 500 cigarettes. Thirdly, and finally, we have what we call normative ethics, which is really going to be the backbone of the show today. So this branch of ethics deals with these more prescriptive, what should we do questions. So for example, Christian morality, i.e. do unto others what you would have them do unto yourself, don't covet thy neighbor's wife, don't eat shellfish, I guess. This is an example of normative ethics, specifically deontological normative ethics. More on that later on. And what these two takes on the Jonah Hill situation are doing is that they are disagreeing on questions of normative ethics, i.e. questions of what we should do in order to be good. So, XQC is giving a view which most closely aligns with traditional liberal political philosophy. He's saying that individual freedom is the basis of a just society, and the only thing that's required for an ethical outcome is that the maximum amount of individual freedom is achieved for everyone, whilst minimizing the impact that this has on other people's rights. This is the kind of philosophy of ethics that we might most closely associate with 19th century English philosopher John Stuart Mill, who came out with bangers like, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it." Now, Mill's specific brand of normative ethics belonged to what we would call utilitarian consequentialist ethics. Now, that's a lot of big words, so what do we mean? So within any human action, there are three ingredients. There is the agent, usually a person or persons committing the action. There is the action itself. And then there is the outcome or the consequence of the action. Consequentialist ethics argues that even ostensibly unethical actions like lying, stealing, controlling your girlfriend's professional life, or swimwear can be considered ethical so long as they produce an ethical outcome. And under utilitarian consequentialism, this desired ethical outcome is producing the most good for the most people, which we've already heard Mill specifically defines as maximizing the freedom of the individual from restrictions on their liberty. So under this Millian ethics, we could view Jonah Hill's list of demands as ethical, because after all, Brady is free to leave should she not agree with the list of demands. Her freedom to pursue her own good in her own way, as Mill would say, has not been limited because she can still just opt out of the relationship. And that is exactly what that Twitch streamer XQC is arguing, albeit with much less philosophical flair than I have here and much more spaghetti for some unknown reason. Do better, XQC. By contrast, Matt Bernstein's take on the Jonah Hill situation is that Hill is acting unethically because, Bernstein suggests, there are inherent limits to what we can reasonably ask of others, regardless of whether or not the person that we ask can refuse our request. So when he gives some examples of what may constitute legitimate or illegitimate boundaries, he's trying to sketch the parameters of these sorts of limits. So Bernstein is saying that the substance of the request is as important, if not more important, than the outcome. And by doing so, he is shifting the ethical focus from the consequence of the action to the action itself. He is implying that there are certain rules that govern what it is just to request of others, even if we don't limit their freedom to refuse our request. But what exactly are these rules? Why is it legitimate to have a boundary that you don't want to go out drinking, but not legitimate to have a boundary that you don't want your partner to wear bikinis? So Matt Bernstein doesn't really spell this out. And to be fair to him, I am pulling on an Instagram carousel as my source material. It's not like, he's set out some thesis spelling out his entire ethical philosophy. But where other commentators have stepped in and tried to provide this greater level of detail, they've also come up pretty short. Generally, they have argued that legitimate boundaries are something that you set for yourself and your own behavior, whereas illegitimate boundaries are something that you impose on other people regarding their behavior. So there's this control element. But I think this is actually quite a false dichotomy, right? Because yes, Jonah Hill was clearly trying to control Sarah Brady, but he was doing that with the threat of altering his own behavior towards her, which is really what is happening every time you enforce a boundary. You are showing somebody that their behavior is not acceptable and thus seeking to change their behavior, or at least give them the option to change their behavior by changing your own behavior towards them. For example, if somebody is yelling at you and one of your boundaries is not to be yelled at in your relationships, you might choose to leave the room. Or ultimately, if the yelling continues, the relationship. So clearly what makes Jonah Hill's boundaries so illegitimate is not this kind of false binary between boundaries that are for my behavior are good and boundaries that are for your behavior are bad, because boundaries are inherently always relational. They're always about your relationships to other people. So there's always elements of my behavior and your behavior in them. And this theme of the left essentially trying to make rules for ethical behavior that appear to be clear and logical, but actually kind of aren't, is something that I'm going to get into in more detail in the next section, where I'm going to tell you a little story about transformative justice. So forewarning, this section is going to contain mention of both cancel culture and sexual assault. So if you're not in a place to listen to that today, that's absolutely fine. Join back maybe in about 10-15 minutes. So far then, we have rehashed the internet drama surrounding Jonah Hill and his inability to date women with a perceivable physical form. I have outlined how most of the right-wing/center-right-wing takes on Hill's dispute with his now ex-girlfriend Sarah Brady around his so-called boundaries generally agreed with and defended Hill's position from the standpoint of a traditional liberal understanding of political philosophy that stresses the importance of individual freedom as the kind of overarching goal of an ethical society. I then suggested that the more left-wing takes that disagreed with Hill's right to impose these so-called boundaries were grounded in a different kind of ethical philosophy, one that stressed the existence of certain rules that dictate what are ethical and unethical actions. In this case, these were largely unspoken rules that dictated what are good and bad examples of boundaries. Ultimately, I suggested that these more left-wing takes actually did quite a bad job in defining what those rules are. Now, I know that the theme of the show today is justice, so you might, again, be wondering, where am I going with this? Why have I spent so much time talking about Jonah Hill? Well, essentially, I wanted to lead you into the discussion of ethics with a light example because I now want to take you into a trickier example. Now, just again, to flag the content warning in this section, it's going to be about sexual assault and cancel culture. So my thinking on this subject has been shaped a lot by two sources. The first is the book Conflict is Not Abuse, The Overstatement of Harm and Duty of Community Repair by Sarah Schulman, which I'll talk about in more detail later on, and also the general work of Clementine Morrigan, a Canadian activist, writer, and podcaster who you can find on Insta at Clementine Morrigan or at the fucking cancelled pod. If by the end of the show you're looking for more material like what I'm going to talk about, these are two really great sources to start with. So I want to start by telling you a story about a discussion that I had at an activist event on transformative justice last year. So overall, the event was good. There was a lot of great speakers and organizations involved. However, this conversation happened when I was sat at one of the breakout discussion tables with other event attendees. And I was sat next to another participant, let's call her Wendy. Not her real name, but we'll call her Wendy for the purposes of this segment, who was telling me about a transformative justice process that her activist organization had engaged in. So for those who are not aware of what transformative justice is, it is essentially a political aspiration that comes out of the prison abolitionist movement and general opposition to the current criminal justice system. And it says basically, we can do things differently. It argues that the police, courts, and prisons are not only ineffective at dealing with crime, but also are inhumane and unjust in their attempts to do so. And it tries to position a number of alternatives to the current carceral system. Although ultimately it still remains a pretty vague term because there's not really any one specific way to do transformative justice. So anyway, I was sat at this breakout discussion with other participants of the event, and Wendy begins telling us about the transformative justice process that her organization had engaged in when one of their members had accused another one of their members of sexual assault. So, as an activist organization, they all had abolitionist principles. And because of this, the accuser didn't want to go down the police, courts, and prisons route, and instead wanted to go down this transformative justice route. Very understandable, very admirable, all good so far. So I'll now briefly describe the process to you as Wendy described it to me. The woman bringing the accusation, let's call her Sarah, recounted what had happened in her own words to one trusted member of the organization, who in turn did not ask Sarah any questions about the event or press her to provide any further details, nor did they repeat Sarah's account of the event to other members in the organization. There is a conscious decision made not to investigate any of Sarah's account, as it was the moral conviction within the organization that we should believe victims. Sarah then sets some parameters for what she would like to happen. She details that she wants the accused man in question, let's call him Tom, who's a very prolific activist involved in a number of organizations, not just the one he's in with Sarah, to cease his engagement with all these other organizations apart from the one that pays him a living, so he would not be left destitute. Sarah also states that she doesn't want to see Tom, she doesn't want him to know that she's the person who has made the accusation, and she doesn't want him to be told what her specific accusation was. So Tom is not informed of any of these things. Tom is simply informed that an accusation has been made against him by another member of the organization. The organization then decided to set up a kind of transformative justice committee to manage the whole process. And the committee decides to fundraise to send Tom to see a therapist that they have selected for him. The intention had been to keep this process confidential within the committee. Ultimately, however, rumors begin to spread about Tom throughout the wider community, and another feminist activist group starts a social media call-out and a WhatsApp chain calling Tom a rapist and abuser, which then proceeded to spread very quickly around the city that they all lived in. Tom eventually moves to another city, and when I asked Wendy if she knows, how he is or if she was still in touch with him, she said that neither she nor anyone else from the organization remained friends with him after this process. Now, I already suggested at the end of the last section that the left-wing take on ethics has tended to gravitate a bit more towards trying to codify certain laws that govern ethical behavior that tells us what's good and bad, whereas the right-wing take has generally been more focused on guarding the outcomes of individual freedom and liberty. Both approaches, in my view, fall short, and this example really, I think, shows how badly the left-wing approach can be warped. Essentially, Wendy's organization has been guided by two principles, what we might call maxims, which just means like a moral principle. And their two maxims are abolish the police and prisons and believe victims. Now, on the surface, I have absolutely no problem with these maxims. In fact, I subscribe to both beliefs to varying degrees, hence why I was at the transformative justice event in the first place. What I do have a problem with is how they were applied in this situation, because essentially what has happened here is this organization appears to have taken these maxims completely at surface level and not really thought critically about why we as abolitionists hold those views. So instead of asking themselves, why exactly do we think that the police and prisons are bad, a question that might have led them down the route of detailing the kinds of injustices and dehumanizing treatment that people suffer in the current criminal justice system, both as an accused person and as an accuser, they have just understood this maxim to mean, so long as we're not turning to the police and the courts, we are on our way to an ethical outcome. Similarly, instead of asking, why has it been necessary to develop a motto that we should believe victims, which might lead them to reflect on under what circumstances have victims traditionally not been believed? Do those circumstances apply here? And what actions can we ethically justify with this belief? They have just uncritically accepted that anyone presenting this kind of accusation should be unquestioningly believed, and that this belief should be taken as sufficient to justify any and all further demands that this person makes. Because let's break down exactly what it is that this organization did. They were presented with an accusation which was made once to one person who was not allowed to repeat it to anybody else or ask any questions. And I get the intention behind this initial step, right? Because famously, people, predominantly women, who take these kinds of accusations to the police are then brutally interrogated, with these interrogations often being a traumatizing event in and of themselves. And I get that because I've fucking done that, right? I have taken an accusation like this to the police and it was a horrific experience. So I get why they are trying to not replicate that system of re-traumatization. But I would argue that there has to be a middle ground somewhere between aggressive interrogations of people trying to report sexual violence and saying to someone, don't worry, you don't even have to tell us what happened. We'll take it from here and we'll do whatever it is that you ask. Clearly, this second system opens up a whole other possibility for abuse, except not against the accuser, as happens in the traditional criminal justice system, but against the accused. To then say to the accused, you are not allowed to know either what you're being accused of or by whom, effectively saying you are not allowed to defend yourself or present your side of the story, but you now have to quit all of your jobs and voluntary commitments and submit to a course of therapy that we will pick for you in order for us to be satisfied that you are committed to this transformative justice process is just demonstrably unhinged. And whilst, Wendy did not explicitly say that anybody threatened Tom with social isolation, i.e., nobody explicitly said, do this or we won't be friends with you anymore, I think the fact that Tom moved city and is not friends with any of them anymore kind of speaks for itself. Now, just to be clear, I am not saying that I believe that Tom is innocent in this scenario or that I believe that this was a malicious, false accusation. My issue with this situation does not hinge on whether Tom was innocent or guilty. He could have absolutely done that shit, and I still would believe that what was done here in this situation was wrong. And it was wrong both ethically and in terms of efficacy, because at the ethical level, what this transformative justice process has done is essentially taken many of the worst things that the criminal justice system does to people bringing these kinds of accusations and inverted them against Tom, who at every stage was disbelieved, dehumanized, and disempowered. And you might say, hey, I'm actually ethically fine with that because this has been happening to victims forever and it's about time that abusers got a taste of their own medicine. To which I would say, firstly, we haven't established who has done what here, so we haven't established whether Tom is an abuser or not. Secondly, I would say if that's your take, we need to stop pretending that this is about transformative justice. This is clearly not about wanting to undo the harms of the criminal justice system. This is about wanting to take revenge against that system and the people that we perceive as upholding or benefiting from it, which is very different. Vengeance and transformative justice are actually mutually exclusive terms, and they cannot coexist. Then, turning to the efficacy level, say Tom did actually do this shit, right? Say he did sexually assault Sarah. How is he supposed to be properly rehabilitated if he is never faced with the reality of what it is that he did? So most people who commit acts of sexual violence wouldn't describe what they did as sexual violence, which is the crux of the problem. If he is never told, here is what you did, and here is what the consequences were for the people affected, how is he supposed to change his mind? In fact, how is he supposed to engage in an effective relationship with a therapist who he was not allowed to choose and who he cannot tell why he is actually in therapy because he does not know? And in fact, I would question what caliber of therapist would take a client under these murky ethical conditions. Presumably not a very good one, right? Finally, Tom, being harassed out of town by essentially a cancellation campaign, rehabilitates him in what way? Say he is a predator, right? Say he did intentionally and violently assault someone. What happens now? He's just moved to a new city, except he's also much more unstable because of everything that's just happened, and people don't know his history. Do we think he is more or less likely to do this kind of shit again? And even if the cancellation campaign is successful in following him to a new city and warning people there, we are essentially just moving this increasingly unstable predator around. Beyond being unethical, I just don't think that this is an effective strategy. Now, the reason I've gone into this example is because I think it really demonstrates a weakness that I perceive at the moment within a lot of left-wing circles, particularly chronically online left-wing circles, in their consideration of issues relating to justice and ethics. And I say this as a person who is left-wing and chronically online, and who has been deeply personally affected by these kinds of issues. But there has been, in recent years, I would argue, an increasingly dogmatic obsession with certain ethical rules and maxims that has now kind of erased any real critical thinking on the subject of ethics. For example, you cannot, on the one hand, be a prison abolitionist and hold the maxim abolish prisons, and on the other hand, believe that all rapists and abusers should be cast out of society, because that is literally what prisons do, right? Like, that is why we invented the prison, to cast people out of society. You are just reinventing prisons. And at the level of political philosophy, I think what these certain segments of the left are trying to do is create a sort of pseudo-deontological theory of ethics for social justice politics. Now, what is deontological ethics? Well, if you'll remember at the start of the show, I said that there were three main families of ethics that focus on either the actor, the action, or the outcome. And consequentialist ethics and J.S. Mill were part of that bit that focused on the outcome or consequence. Well, deontological ethics is the bit that focuses on the action, and it seeks to create rules to classify what are good and bad actions. Now, traditionally, deontological ethics tries to identify very broad, very universal rules that can tell us how to act in an ethical way. Ideally, deontologists wanted to identify as few rules as possible so that they could be as universal as possible. So, for example, 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant is probably the most famous deontological philosopher, and he identified essentially 3 rules, which were all different parts of what he called his categorical imperative. And these were all just concerned with respecting the humanity of other people. So the most famous part of the categorical imperative just says, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it became universal law. Which essentially just meant if you wouldn't want someone else to do to you what you were doing to them, then don't do it. This is a pretty far cry from the milieu of comparably incredibly specific rules that we see emerging from certain segments of the modern left, and therein lies the problem, right? Because deontological philosophers recognize that there are only very few things that you can generalize to this level, that it has to be a rule that is inflexibly maintained in every situation. It's actually really difficult to set out general rules for an ethical life, and that is why they created so few of them. But by pretending that it is possible to have a coherent ethical philosophy based off of dozens, if not hundreds, of these kind of micro-ethical maxims, certain segments of the modern left are aping the aesthetics of ethics without any of the substance. Essentially, a lot of how we think about justice within left-wing circles has become about performing our compliance with this ever-expanding set of rules that we have set for ourselves, rather than thinking critically about what does this action actually mean for my values? What does it mean for my overall political goals? What even are my overall political goals? If we are going to go down the hard and fast concrete moral rules route, a la deontological ethics, I would suggest one that Clementine Morrigan uses a lot in her writing as an alternative, and that is, no one is disposable. I think this is the closest thing I've seen to a modern update of Kant's categorical imperative, and I think it would go a long way in grounding our politics and activism in compassion rather than compliance. Now, I've given one small example here about what this political culture of moral absolutism can mean for our behavior and how we treat each other. But what I want to dig into for the rest of the show are the more like macro level effects and ask, what does this culture do to us at a societal level? So that's the most emotionally tricky example out of the way. I now want to, zoom out a bit and look more at the structural level, and hopefully these examples might be a bit less jarring. So I recently read a book by queer Jewish academic Sarah Schulman called Conflict is Not Abuse, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair, which I referenced briefly in the last section, and I'd really recommend it to anyone listening. It's one of those books that you read and you really don't agree with everything that she has to say, but that's kind of what makes it great because it really gets you thinking. The book itself is kind of extremely chaotic. It's not really like an academic book. It's not got any citations, although clearly parts of it are very well researched. It's not like a traditional nonfiction book that fairly systematically lays out an evidenced argument. Rather, the chapters are all their own discrete essays, so they don't always tie in with each other. At times, I did find myself questioning which fucking insane editor signed off on this book, because the final chapter has about 20 pages, which are literally just a copied and pasted in Facebook comments chain. But despite all of that, I really like the book because I think it gives some very interesting perspectives on a subject which I think is quite under-discussed in the left, and that is essentially cancel culture. Now, Schulman doesn't at any point in the book actually say the words cancel culture. She instead frames her focus as being on how a heightened rhetoric of threat that confuses doing nothing, normative conflict, and resistance with actual abuse has produced a wide practice of overstating harm, and that this overstatement of harm is often expressed in shunning, a literal refusal to speak in person with another human being or group of people, an exclusion of their information, the active obstruction to a person being heard, and the pretense that they do not exist. So her central argument is really that there is, a growing tendency within society to overstate the harm that has been caused by a person or persons, and then engaged in a kind of traumatized, shunning response where you completely shut down and stonewall any attempts at reconciliation, essentially canceling them. Throughout the book, she kind of builds up different levels of examples where she has seen this happening. So first, she takes quite minor examples from her own life where, for example, a colleague misinterprets a comment that she has made and then essentially labels her as an abuser and completely blocks any of her attempts at an explanation, to more extreme examples like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which she conceptualizes as the Israelis overstating the threat posed by Palestinian resistance and using this overstatement to justify extremely cruel and repressive treatment of Palestinians, even up to the point of mass murder. And I quite like this framing that she has, where she draws a direct parallel between the relationship of how we treat each other and how the state treats us, or how states treat each other, essentially arguing that this culture of encouraging the overstatement of abuse works in favor of a repressive state. I think the strongest example she pulls for this is the criminalization of HIV. Now, a lot of people don't realize that having HIV is in many ways criminalized by many different countries. So many, many moons ago, I used to work with an HIV charity back in Buenos Aires, and I was doing a little bit of research for them on the status of HIV criminalization in different countries. So there are, broadly speaking, 3 kinds of laws that criminalize being HIV positive. So there is the criminalization of transmission, which is when you can be prosecuted for giving HIV to somebody else. There is the criminalization of exposure, which is when you can be prosecuted for allegedly putting somebody else at risk of catching HIV, even where no transmission occurs. And then there is the criminalization of freedom of movement for people who are HIV positive. So a lot of countries will have, as part of their visa requirements, stipulations that you cannot be HIV positive in order to be eligible for a visa. Most countries won't have any restrictions on short-term travel like holidays, but a lot of countries, for example, Australia, will have restrictions on longer-term visas for people who are HIV positive. And they'll defend this on the basis that these individuals will cost the public healthcare system a lot of money. But they're obviously still hugely discriminatory bits of legislation because, that argument could just as easily be applied to a range of different characteristics. Imagine if we started putting a weight restriction on visa requirements on the grounds that being severely overweight is linked to a number of negative health outcomes that could also be expensive for the public healthcare system. Clearly, that wouldn't fly, right? But yeah, back to HIV criminalization. Schulman argues that the success of HIV criminalization legislation is contingent on getting people to buy into this logic of overstating harm. So she looks specifically at the case of Canada, which effectively criminalized HIV exposure and transmission through a 2012 Supreme Court ruling, which in and of itself is revealing, right? Because 2012 is almost 3 decades after the peak of the epidemic. This is not the time when people didn't know what the disease was. They didn't know how it was transmitted or how to protect themselves, when there was no effective medication and it was essentially a death sentence. By 2012, none of these things are true. And yet it is at this late stage in the game that Canada criminalizes HIV. Now, what happens in Canada in 2012 is that a Supreme Court ruling criminalizes HIV non-disclosure, which essentially is when an HIV-positive person does not disclose their HIV status to prospective sexual partners before engaging in sexual intercourse. Now, that might sound like fairly all right on the surface. I'm sure we would all like to think that the people that we are having sex with are going to be open and honest with us about their sexual health status. However, there's a couple of things to consider. Firstly, since the invention of more effective antiretroviral medications, sometimes called ARTs, sometime in the late 1990s, it has been possible for people who are HIV positive to become what we call undetectable, which is essentially when the viral load of HIV in their bloodstream becomes so suppressed by the medication that it is impossible to detect, and it would be impossible for them to transmit the virus to another person, even if they were to engage in high-risk behavior like having unprotected sex or sharing needles, etc. So in the case of someone with an undetectable viral load, is there really a moral imperative for them to inform you that they are HIV positive? Some people might still say yes, but I myself wouldn't necessarily agree, particularly considering how heavily stigmatized HIV still is, and considering the fact that most people are very ignorant about the disease and wouldn't know things like undetectable equals untransmittable, so are unlikely to have a very measured response to this information. Or even considering the fact that there are a lot of ways that you can protect yourself from catching HIV as an HIV negative person. So for example, if you know you are at high risk of being exposed to HIV, say you engage in a lot of unprotected sex with at-risk groups, or you're an intravenous drug user who shares needles, there are medications that you can take preemptively to prevent transmission called PrEP, standing for pre-exposure prophylaxis. And even if you are exposed to HIV and aren't already on PrEP, there are other medications you can take after the fact to prevent transmission called PEP, meaning post-exposure prophylaxis. So with all these developments in mind that make HIV less transmittable and allow HIV-negative people to better protect themselves against transmission, I think the moral imperative on the HIV person to disclose to everyone that they meet that they have it is at the very least much less now than it used to be, and arguably in some circumstances isn't even there at all. The second problem with the criminalization of non-disclosure is that it creates what in policy-making circles they call perverse incentives. Essentially, you are only criminally liable if you are HIV positive and you know that you are HIV positive and fail to disclose. If you do not know that you are HIV positive, you cannot, by definition, fail to disclose your status because you don't know it. So basically, by criminalizing non-disclosure, you incentivize people to not get tested for HIV, because so long as they are not sure whether they are positive or negative, they are not criminally liable. So at these two levels, I would argue that the criminalization of HIV non-disclosure, and bear in mind that you can be prosecuted for not disclosing your status, even in cases where you don't transmit the virus, and in fact transmission would have been impossible, such as when you have an undetectable viral load and/or have used condoms, firstly depends on a significant overstatement of harm in terms of the risks posed in these scenarios, and secondly is just an ineffective policy at a kind of public health protection level, because it discourages people from regular testing, which is the most important thing for suppressing HIV transmission. In order for this kind of criminalization to be effective, people have to buy into this logic of overstatement of harm. They have to conceptualize themselves as the victim of a malicious and deceptive sexual partner. This is necessary so that they believe that a carceral state response is an appropriate reaction to their interpersonal conflict. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about the very rare cases where somebody has very intentionally transmitted HIV to somebody else, where they had a high viral load, knew their status, and actively deceived the other person. That's a whole other kettle of fish. I'm talking about the more general criminalization of the sexual lives of people who are HIV positive. As Schulman writes, implicit in the court rulings is the idea that HIV-negative people are not legally responsible to protect themselves from HIV, and that in fact the responsibility lies only with the positive partner. With criminalization, the responsibility of negatives, HIV-negative people, is ignored, with all emphasis on either disclosing or calling the police. Instead of encouraging more open communication between lovers, the government is imposing itself as a substitute for learning how to problem solve. And I think this is a really key point, because historically, the community which has been most affected by HIV has been men who have sex with men. That's actually not the case anymore, and recently transmission rates in the UK between heterosexual couples outstripped transmission rates amongst men who have sex with men for the first time, likely because the heterosexual community is less knowledgeable about HIV risk and prevention, but that's an aside. But when we consider the fact that men who have sex with men have traditionally been treated very poorly by the state, homosexuality was criminalized up until only a few decades ago, and gay couples still to this day have a host of limitations on their rights in many Western countries in terms of marriage, families, etc., that many heterosexual couples simply don't. Despite this fact, HIV criminalization has managed to convince this community to identify with the very state that has been so repressive to them and call upon that state to police conflict with other members of their own community. So in this way, the moral cultures that we see proliferating around cancellation, as some might call it, or overstatement of harm, as Sarah Schulman might call it, works in favor of the state. They are underpinned by the kind of binary logic of good and evil that states have relied on throughout history, this assumption that humanity can be neatly split into good and bad people, that you are renowned national treasure American cryptologist Benjamin Franklin Gates or despised treasure hunter Ian Howe, a hero or a villain, an insider or an outsider, a citizen or a foreigner, that you can only ever be either victim or abuser, and that the powerful state is the natural arbiter of these splits. But far from creating greater safety for ordinary people, this view of morality mainly serves to create further division. And that's because if we identify ourselves as victims and we identify the source of our victimization from within our own communities rather than within wider structures of injustice, like, for example, the inaccessibility of high-quality healthcare, homophobia, the stigmatization of HIV, etc., then our energy and outrage is never targeted at these structures and instead is always targeted inwards to the community itself, ensuring that we remain fragmented and politically ineffective. In this sense, moral logics that rely on the overstatement of harm are enormously disempowering and will always position the repressive state as a necessary savior in the face of an untold number of evils. This fundamentally works in favor of the status quo, which is what we're about to unpack in the next and final section of the show, where I'm going to talk about a little book called Power, Crime, and Mystification. So this episode, we've had a bit of a rambling journey through the philosophical and ethical questions surrounding justice. Now, to conclude, I want to kind of draw all of these thoughts that we've been mulling over together. So I began by, arguing that a lot of ethical debate on the left, as opposed to the right, has been focused on the creation of a complex framework of rules that supposedly govern ethical behavior and prescribing what behavior is good and what behavior is bad. I then argued that this kind of ethical thinking can lead to a view of the world which incentivizes an overstatement of harm that fundamentally benefits repressive structures like the carceral state. By constructing ethical monsters everywhere, we are incentivized to look to the police, the courts, and the prisons for protection. And even when we try to reject these actors and implement our own processes, as was the case in the transformative justice example, the underlying moral logic means that we ultimately end up mimicking the repressive behavior of these carceral actors. All of this serves to obscure larger structural oppressions within society. Now, the book I want to talk about here is actually a pretty old book. I think it was published in 1983. I accidentally stole it from my high school modern studies teacher, who I'm assuming read it at university. So yeah, if you ever hear this, Miss Halliday, I'm really sorry that I stole your book. But at least I got a lot out of it, right? Anyway, the book is called Power, Crime, and Mystification. It's by a radical criminologist called Stephen Box. And in this book, Box argues that the entire way that we conceptualize crime serves to focus our attention on the crimes of the powerless and away from what he would argue are the comparatively more harmful crimes of the powerful. So when we think about crime, we tend to think about things like robbery, assault, vandalism, etc., which are all very visible, tangible actions, something which criminologists used to call, controversially now, blue-collar crimes. We don't tend to think about the more far-reaching crimes of, for example, corporations. So we don't think about things like corporate environmental crime, where a corporation decides that it is simply more profitable for them to cause serious environmental harm than it would be for them to take the necessary steps to ensure that this doesn't occur. Like, for example, Weetabix, who in 2019 were prosecuted for polluting the River Ise in Northamptonshire by dumping 23,000 litres of raw diesel. We don't tend to think about things like corporate manslaughter, where corporations have directly caused the death of their employees or members of the public because they cut corners on health and safety procedures in order to maximize profits, as, for example, MNS Mining was found to have done in 2013, when the Crown Prosecution Service ruled that the death of 4 miners was directly caused by the manager's decision to ignore safety regulations and continue to dig into a previously flooded tunnel, releasing 500,000 gallons of water. We also don't tend to think about things like more generalized corporate violence, like when pharmaceutical companies falsify or otherwise misrepresent their test data in order to more effectively sell their products, as was famously the case with thalidomide, a drug that was prescribed to pregnant women across the US, Germany, Japan, the UK, Ireland, Sweden, Spain, Italy, Canada, and Brazil in the late 1960s, and was found to have caused the deformity of over 8,000 babies, many of whom were born without arms or legs. Or even more recently with the opioid epidemic in the United States, which ongoing lawsuits are arguing has been the direct consequence of misrepresentations made by Purdue Pharmaceuticals surrounding the potency and addiction risks of their drug oxycodone that has led to almost 1 million deaths in the United States and Canada since 1999. And the reason we don't tend to think about these examples when we think about crime is because it is baked into the legal system itself. There are entirely different systems for policing the crimes of the powerful than there are for policing the crimes of the powerless. The penalties for the crimes of the powerful are most often fines rather than prisons, and these fines are generally of such an insignificant level that they can just be factored in as an expense. Generally, also, what we might call more traditional crimes are policed by the actual fucking police, right? And we all know how fucked up they are. And if you don't, check out my episode on the police. But the crimes of corporations are policed by an entirely different system, usually more administrative and regulatory agencies, which often do not proactively monitor for these kinds of crimes, but rather rely on reports or whistleblowers to activate an investigation. Typically, these agencies are under-resourced and often have overly familiar relationships with the very corporations that they are entrusted to police, with there being what some have called a revolving door between regulatory agencies and the private sector, wherein the same individuals who have worked in these regulatory agencies will then leave to go and work for the very companies that they were entrusted with regulating, and vice versa. For example, it might interest you to know that the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, which is entrusted with monitoring consumer protections in the financial services, so ensuring essentially that banks don't sell you predatory financial products and completely fuck you over, is entirely funded by the financial sector itself. The FCA is supposed to act like a semi-public sector institution, but it might also interest you to know that FCA employees have a number of perks in their remuneration packages that traditional public sector employees don't have, like, for example, private healthcare, which is definitely a luxury in the UK, right? Additionally, when the FCA advertise for jobs, they explicitly look for people with experience in the banking sector and vice versa. When banks hire for positions like compliance officers, having worked for the FCA is specified as a desired trait. Knowing this, it's then not really surprising that when the UK government was considering whether or not to lift the cap imposed on bankers' bonuses after the 2008 financial collapse, that was itself caused by the reckless actions of the financial sector, the FCA wholeheartedly endorsed lifting the cap, and in fact, they had already imposed the introduction of the cap in the first place. All of this serves to completely obscure the very real, very pervasive, and very systemic injustices perpetrated by the powerful against us, the masses, the powerless. And my argument here is that our hyperfixation of policing the boundaries of morality within our own communities is just further feeding this cycle of what Box calls mystification. And that's all for me today, guys. Thanks for those of you who stuck around since the beginning. It's been quite a long haul. I hope that you've enjoyed the show. If you have, don't forget to check back in, check out some other episodes, let your pals know, get a tattoo of my face on your face, etc. Like all the standard, normal responses to liking something. If you've really liked the show, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/militantempathy, and you can help us keep this shit show on the road. And on that note, be good to each other. I'll see you soon for the next one.